Welcome to our Compassion Fatigue in the Courts presentation. My name is Courtney Green. I am the Union Vicinage Training Coordinator. Just a little bit about me before we get started. I have been with the judiciary for 2 years now. And prior to joining the courts, I worked actually for CASA of Union County. So I'm familiar with at least some of our volunteers who are here today and the work that you guys have done. I started there as an advocate supervisor, as well as the recruiter for the organization. And then eventually I advanced to program director for my last few years there before taking on this new role within the court. So I'm really excited to be able to be here and present this material to you all. So today I'm going to cover what compassion fatigue is, what it looks like, and just give you some resources and some strategies to address it. If you guys don't mind, I am going to ask before I hop into our presentation, if you just throw in the chat for me what program you're volunteering with and in what county and how long you've been volunteering. Just want to get a sense of my audience and who's in the room. So if you're not familiar, you guys should be able to see the chat function. You can go ahead. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Bergen County mediator for a year. We have Hudson County, 22 years. Wow. ISP volunteers, Passaic and Union CASA. Okay. A fresh CASA since November. Nice, nice, nice. Who else do we have here? CASA of Passaic County. Welcome, welcome, welcome. CPR volunteer coordinator in Passaic. Excellent, excellent. Excellent. Okay, so we have a decent range of volunteer experience, right? As well as with the programs and how long you guys have been volunteering with the courts, I see. So we have some people here for a few months, all the way up to, from what I can tell, at least 22 years. So thank you guys. Thank you for joining me. And thank you for sharing that in the chat. So let's go ahead and jump right in there. So what exactly is compassion fatigue? So compassion fatigue has been described as the cost of caring for others in emotional pain. So really it's referring to the profound emotional and physical erosion that takes place when we're unable to refuel and regenerate. So sometimes what this is really talking about is empathy, right? The inability to be empathetic and compassionate. And sometimes empathy really just begins as a selfless act for caring for those around you, right? Especially as a volunteer and in the work that you do. But if you don't preserve your own well-being in that process, the work and the things that you're experiencing, the things that you might be hearing can eventually become overwhelming. And you might find that ability to be empathetic, right, and compassionate with the people you might be working with, whether it's families or court users, right, or even just colleagues, your other volunteers, or maybe your volunteer supervisors, it might, that empathetic and compassionate side of you might start kind of dwelling, right? It might stop coming to you as naturally, especially if you've been doing it for a while. So you might start feeling like you're extremely helpless, you're tired, right? Maybe guilty in some ways, or even just numb. These things are becoming mundane to you. So that's essentially what compassion fatigue is. It's a gradual emotional erosion and the inability to be empathetic. So it's when we're being emotionally drained by potentially the trauma and the other emotions of those who we are helping, right? Those people that are suffering or that are going through those life challenges. And what's interesting about compassion fatigue is that we're living in a world where it's no longer unique to certain professions or groups of people. So when this term was first coined, Figley was actually speaking about those helping professionals specifically, like nurses, first responders, firefighters, police officers, doctors, et cetera, et cetera. But I believe the world that we live in now, just about anyone who cares for someone or is assisting someone in some way can be affected by compassion fatigue, especially with increased media exposure to worldwide suffering, right? Just about anyone can experience this. Every day, we're hearing news stories about injustices, mass shootings, school shootings, right? Natural disasters. I mean, we just had an earthquake the other day, right? And I was having a conversation with someone who was in the city during the earthquake. And it didn't dawn on me, the conversation led to how that could have been traumatic for people who were in the city during 9/11, right? It could have brought some PTSD symptoms going on. So just think about all of those things, right? when you're being exposed to all these different emotions and maybe potential traumatic experiences, it becomes overwhelming and it's hard for people to stay informed and engaged, right? So when you compile those social issues, both locally and even on a larger scale with your own personal circumstances and other triggers, it can make compassion fatigue very likely in your work. So consider that cumulative toll that constant exposure to life challenges, suffering, hardships, right? All those life frustrations can have on you, right? Personally, individually, think about the families that you work with, the people that you work with, think about the exposure that it has on them as well. So that's where we see compassion fatigue. And that's really what I wanted to make clear here. Now, I know sometimes when you hear compassion fatigue, there's a lot of terms that are thrown around. And I'm sure many of you on the call have probably heard of secondary traumatic stress, secondary victimization, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, burnout, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to take a moment here to be clear that compassion fatigue is not vicarious trauma, nor is it burnout. So I'm going to start with vicarious trauma. Give me 1 second. I think I have some more people in the waiting room. Perfect. Okay. So vicarious trauma is, this term was coined back in the 90s to describe the profound shift in worldview that occurs in people when they work with others who have experienced trauma. So what this means is that the fundamental beliefs of those people about the world have altered, and they've been possibly damaged by being repeatedly exposed to different types of traumatic material, okay? So people who regularly experience vicarious trauma essentially come to share those feelings of the victim's feelings of heartbreak, right? Devastation, maybe fear, neglect, whatever it may be. And that can cause you to neglect your own self-care. So here, what we're really talking about is the impact and the shift in how we view the world, right? How we view others and how we sense danger around us. It's describing that impact of indirect trauma and how it's going to change your inner experiences, right? How you're sensing danger, how you're engaging with one another, and how you see the world. Very, very different from compassion fatigue, much more complex than compassion fatigue as well. Now, burnout, on the other hand, this term was coined back in the 80s, and this is really just describing the physical and emotional exhaustion that workers feel and can experience when they have low job satisfaction and feel powerless, maybe overwhelmed at work, right? So this is really originating from occupational stress and being overworked. And typically, burnout can be it can be something, it could be impacted or worked out, so to speak, with just a change like time off, right? Or taking a new job, taking on a new role, things like that. That can really improve burnout. So here, burnout doesn't necessarily mean that our view of the world or how we interact with the world, how we sense danger has been changed or has been damaged, right? It also doesn't necessarily mean that we've lost the ability to feel compassionate or to be empathetic with other people. And it also does not require trauma to be present or to have occurred, right? So it's generally something that happens over time. Again, when someone just has low job satisfaction or is feeling overworked, okay? So again, going back to the difference between vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue, I want to remind everyone, compassion fatigue is the emotional exhaustion that we feel from bearing witness to the suffering of another, right? It's the inability for us to be empathetic. Trauma doesn't necessarily need to be present as well. And unlike burnout, this stems from not being able to remove oneself from work long enough to recover and revive, right? We are unable to refuel and to regenerate. So I have a quote here for you guys that I use specifically in this training that I provide within the course. And I'm going to read it, and I want to get your thoughts on it in the chat, okay? So this quote is from Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. She's a clinical professor at the University of California in San Francisco. And her quote is, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." This sort of denial is no small matter, right? The way we deal with loss shapes our capacity to be present to life more than anything else. And the way we protect ourselves from loss may be the way in which we distance ourselves from life and hope. So I want to hear from you guys. Throw in the chat. What does this mean to you? What do you take away from this quote? Okay, empathy has its limits. That's a thought. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Any other comments or thoughts? Oh yeah, right, Tamiko? It's important to be sure to take care of yourself also, right? We should be mindful of our mental state in such situations. Caring can be exhausting. Yeah, it takes a toll. It takes a toll, right? I think the most impactful part of this quote is that very first sentence, right? The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. It's very important to have these conversations, right? Talking about well-being and self-care and how we overcome certain things is important. I see some more thoughts in the chat. People deal with loss by detaching with, which then results in distancing yourself with life in general. Yeah, right. We're no good to others if we're not good to ourselves. I love that, Paul. I love that. That sums it up, right? We are impacted by each other's experiences, right? Not just by your other volunteers, but the families that you work with, parents that you're working with, right? The individuals that you're working with. But if you guys still have your own day-to-day jobs, your own families, you're being impacted by your work and your family's experiences as well. And having that compassion or expecting to be expected to have that compassion, right? Day in and day out when you're working on tough cases or working with maybe tough and frustrating people, it can be overwhelming. It certainly can. It's impactful on all of us. So conversations around things like this, may it be compassion fatigue, burnout, just overall well-being are very, very important. And did you guys know, fun fact, I love sharing fun facts. Were you aware that when people feel emotional pain, right, the same areas of the brain get activated as when people feel physical pain? If you didn't know, now you know. And that's another reason why I think these conversations around these topics are so important, right? Not only for our overall well-being and growth and development, but also to expand our understanding of life and of each other. So I want to explore just some risk factors and some signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue with you all. So this can get really interesting, right? Sometimes the person or people that are being affected by compassion fatigue, they don't even realize that that's what they're experiencing. There can be so many symptoms that overlap with many other things, right? But as such, the first important step to managing anything is awareness and that ability to identify where it's coming from, right? What's the trigger? What's the catalyst? So here on the screen, I just have a couple of risk factors for compassion fatigue specifically. The first, I'm going to start over here in that top right corner, your personal circumstances, right? So your personal circumstances can put you at risk. That includes things such as your history, right? Your own personal history, maybe your childhood history, having a history of childhood adversity, your own coping style, your personalities, right? Your ability to manage stress. Maybe you're navigating a challenging family crisis currently. It could be, maybe a custody dispute, family issues, a divorce, fertility issues, maybe some financial stress for yourself or for your family. Maybe you're providing care for someone with significant needs, maybe medical needs. Maybe you have a family member or a child that has a learning disability, right? Or has any other type of needs. So there's a lot of things here, at least with personal circumstances, that can put you at risk for having that low inability to be empathetic with others, right? And to be compassionate with others. Moving on to our work-related traumatic grief and loss. So here, sometimes I think this gets lost, specifically in the workplace, right? So feelings of grief and loss can surface in situations of what you might consider or call unfinished business. I know for myself, when I used to work at CASA, there would be cases sometimes where we would lose a parent, or a child might pass away, right? That's where we're talking about with work-related grief or loss, right? Maybe even if someone's discharged from a program, you've worked with them for so long, it might be a happy thing, but you still feel loss in that, right? So we can experience that feeling of grief and loss in situations like that. Even if a partner agency has closed, right? Things like that. Think about that. Have there been any recent events, maybe in the work that you've been doing, that has caused you, or maybe another volunteer, or the agency that you're volunteering for, the program that you're volunteering for, to feel some type of grief or loss? Okay. And then for direct exposure, so that's referring to your own direct exposure to trauma, right? So similar to personal circumstances. Maybe yourself, you have been a victim or survivor of crime. Maybe you have immigrated here, right? And you've had some negative experiences in that transition. Maybe you are someone who sought asylum in a new country here, right? Or you're experiencing a serious medical crisis. Maybe you've recently been in a car accident. There are many ways that we could be exposed to trauma directly, right? So that will also put you at risk for compassion fatigue. I see something in the chat. I've read that parents that lost a child experiences the worst of human experiences. It's akin to being in a concentration camp, PTSD. I agree with the thought 100%. I'm not a parent, but I have heard the same thing, that losing a child is pretty tough. Personally, I lost my dad a few years ago at what I would consider a young age, but I couldn't imagine being a parent and losing a child. So yeah, it's tough. And I remember those days working at CASA where those things would happen, or even some of our kids, their parents had passed away, and our CASA had to be one of the people in the room or kind of nearby when that news was broken to the child. So thank you for sharing that, Sunita. And then after direct exposure, we have indirect exposure. That's actually a great segue, right? Indirect exposure to trauma. So that can be, or is referring to working with someone who has experienced abuse themselves, or maybe a loss themselves, right? Hearing details of their stories, reading case files. I know many of you probably do that every day, right? Reading your case files, witnessing or hearing graphic testimonies during court cases. I'm pretty sure many of you have experienced that as well, right? Or even having a colleague debrief a traumatic case with you, right? That is all indirect trauma. And I know I mentioned it earlier, when we think about what we're exposed to nowadays, right? Not just on the news, and we have so many mediums and so many channels of information being loaded to us, right? Think about all the things on social media and on the internet, right? Many of us are inadvertently adding to those levels of indirect trauma every day, right? Disturbing news coverage, maybe even just graphic TV shows. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a fan of your, crime shows and things like that. But some of that, sometimes that can be really graphic. So the frequent exposure to those kinds of things, it might make you numb. It might make things very mundane for you, right? It's just not the same. You're not reacting the same. That compassion, that empathy, that sadness, it's just not coming to you anymore. And that leads me to empathetic strain, right? So you might be at risk for developing that, with piggybacking off of everything that I mentioned so far, maybe hearing similar stories from, I know the speaker earlier, Debbie, she worked a number of cases at CASA, right? So for somebody who maybe has been volunteering in the same program for a while, and you're used to hearing similar stories or similar backgrounds, that empathetic strain is likely to happen there. Or maybe you're working with folks who are just chronically overwhelmed, right? Or they never seem to get better, or never take that step that they need to take to get better, right? Or to reach another level. Or if, again, you've worked in the same position, the same field, or the same volunteer program for a while as well. Now, system failures, this becomes a pretty interesting conversation in this presentation that I've been doing. So systems failure is really referring to the red tape, right? Or the roadblocks that prevent us from giving the best possible care or service to those that we're working with, right? So just some examples of that are like maybe someone having to navigate long waiting lists, right? Or convoluted systems, or being expected to, right, to make parenting classes, keep a job, go to their visiting time with their kids. They don't drive, right? So now they're relying on public transportation. Think of all of those things, right? That's systems failure. Large amounts of extraneous or tedious paperwork, right? Getting that runaround sometimes, maybe even disagreements about who should be eligible for a certain service. If you had a child that maybe you advocated for, or to get a certain thing or to be a part of a certain program, and maybe they were denied for whatever reason, right? Because of behavior challenges or something like that. There's so many things that can fall under systems failure. Even sometimes you can include here like morally distressing kind of things, right? As volunteers, you guys aren't necessarily, you abide by code of conduct, but you also have your own morality, right? Your own values, right? So there might be things that you are asked to do or that you have to do that maybe you morally just disagree with, or things that you experience, right? In working with your working your cases or in your volunteer work, that you find conflict with, right? With what's required by the law. But sometimes the issues are bigger than us, right? They're not things that we can tackle in a day or that we can fix in a day. There's a lot of hoops that need to be gone through in order for certain societal things to change, okay? And then we have our working conditions. So I'll cover that really briefly, but that's really speaking to about your experience, right? And the way you perceive your workplace, right? And the relationships with your supervisors and your colleagues. So as volunteers, that one might not apply to you guys as much, but if it does, just some things to consider, right? The quality of your volunteer and your working conditions can be impacted by maybe your sense of trust and leadership, or the quality and timeliness of communication within the program or within the organization, or the degree to which you are fairly thanked for what you do, right? Things like that. And then last but not least, oops, sorry about that. We have our sociocultural context. So this kind of goes along with systems failure. This is really where we're talking about the intersection of who you are, right? How you identify and how all of those elements are at play in your day-to-day and in the work that you do, right? So we're talking about the intersection of race, the intersection of culture, gender, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, historical traumas, right? And any other elements that help define your identity. So those factors might come into collision with some of the work that you guys are doing, or with some of the beliefs or some of the things that you have to follow, the rules, the regulations, right? The laws, the political climate of whatever it is that's affecting the programs that you are volunteering for. So these are just a couple of things to keep in mind for risk factors in terms of compassion fatigue, okay? So I just want to check in with you guys here. If you don't mind sharing, if any, right, throw in the chat, which of these risk factors do you think might be impacting you currently, or impacting someone that you know? I'm not seeing anything. Oh, direct exposure. I see that one, Shelley. Yeah, that's probably a common one, right? Systems failure. That one can be tough, especially as a volunteer. There are a lot of issues that are larger than us. Even for employees of the judiciary, sometimes it's hard when you have court users coming in and they expect things from you that you can't necessarily give, right? Traumatic grief and loss, direct exposure, empathetic strain. Perfect, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So I'm going to cover a couple of signs and symptoms and some other things in this presentation, but after I do that, I'm going to give you guys some resources that should help you a little bit in just mitigating these things, at least with what's in your control, okay? So here on the slide, I just have some examples of many ways that compassion fatigue can show up and affect your personal life and your sense of well-being. So this list is certainly not exhaustive, but I have it here for you guys to kind of review and just self-evaluate, right? Again, self-awareness is really what we want to get out of this today. So do you see yourself here? Look at those behavioral symptoms and signs, the cognitive, emotional, physical, interpersonal, even spiritual, right? Do you have a change in level of engagement? Are you more cynical and pessimistic, right, about the work that we do, or about maybe the court system, right? Unfortunately. Do you have racing thoughts, self-doubt? Are you constantly worried about that child that you're working with, that teenager, right, that might be on probation, that juvenile, whoever, right? Think about those things. Are you feeling powerless and helpless? Are you more irritable? Are you sad all the time? Is that increasing? And I know when it comes to our physical signs and symptoms, there are a lot of things that overlap with that, right? Rapid breathing, headaches, fatigue, aches, that can speak to a lot of different things, sleep disturbance. But I think it most importantly are that interpersonal, those interpersonal signs and symptoms, right? Are you withdrawn? Are you isolating yourself a little bit more? Are you losing interest in your activities or in your own work? Those kinds of things, right? And then even with the spiritual, that loss of purpose or loss of meaning, you're questioning the world, right? Questioning good versus evil. Think about that. So I'm gonna leave this up for just a second so that everyone can get a chance to look through it again. But you don't have to answer. It's just a chance for you to self-evaluate and review. And do you see or have you noticed any of these signs and symptoms in yourselves? And if not, it's something to be aware of as you move forward in the volunteer work that you do. Right. So, I'm pretty good here. So I was just checking our time. So research indicates that there are 4 phases of compassion fatigue. So I'm going to take you guys through all 4. So that first one, this one is the zealot phase. So this is the initial phase of enthusiasm, right? When you feel like you are making a difference in your volunteer work, when an individual is committed, right? You're involved, you're available, you're putting in those extra hours, going the extra mile with tasks and demands. You might be a little overstressed, but you find in ways to justify that stress, so to speak, because you're so excited, you're so committed, you're still new, right, to the whole experience. And you reflect on that. You reflect on your personal and your professional experiences, and you find ways to push on, so to speak, okay? And then that leads to our second phase, which is the irritability phase. So here's where an individual is starting to become distracted, which may lead to making mistakes, right? Oversight, potentially cutting corners, not following through with certain commitments. There might be a change in personality, right? So you're losing maybe a sense of humor, being more impatient, or just as it states, irritable, right? You're moody, a little bit more cynical and critical of yourself and maybe of others. You might start feeling undervalued, under-resourced potentially. And this contrasts with how you felt in that first phase, the zealot phase, or when you first started maybe your volunteer work, right? Maybe you did feel a little undervalued or underappreciated by different stakeholders at an earlier point, but you said to yourself, it's okay. I know this child needs me, these families need me, these people need me, right? The team needs me. You found ways to continue to push on. That starts to get lost here in our irritability phase, which leads us to our next one, right? That withdrawal phase. And like we just saw in the signs and symptoms, that is a big one, right? In that interpersonal category. So here is where that enthusiasm is gone, right? You're complaining of the stress, you're starting to feel that fatigue, right? You're feeling tired all the time. You might be getting sick a little bit more often. You're having difficulty concentrating, a little confused with different things. Maybe if you're working on different cases or in different things, or like I said, if you have your own lives outside of your volunteer work as well, right? So maybe things are getting confused between, like, the lines are starting to blur a little bit with volunteer work and your actual work and your own personal responsibilities, right? They're blending in with each other. Stories might be difficult to distinguish between. And here is really where we see, as it states, that withdrawal start to happen, right? An individual may be starting to neglect and detach themselves from others. And lastly, this is where you start to see the use of unhealthy coping mechanisms. And then that leads me to our fourth and final phase of compassion fatigue. So this is where everything has gone out the window. You are on autopilot, right? I'm sure many of people have heard someone say, like, I clock in and I clock out. Like I just come in, do what I gotta do, and I get out. That is that zombie phase, right? You're on autopilot. You're feeling less confident. You're very cynical, right? You may be making mistakes. You just start to doubt the work. You start to doubt your ability. You're feeling depleted. You're numb, maybe apathetic, right? And just feeling like there's no worth in it anymore. And continuing from that previous phase, the withdrawal phase, you're feeling disconnected, right, from others, the work that you're doing. You may start to feel like you really have nothing left to give, whether that's with the people that you're working with, yourself, right, or your friends and family. And even here, the use of unhealthy coping mechanisms may start or continue. Okay. And again, I share these things with you as a way for you to be informed, and just to develop the ability to recognize the signs, the symptoms, those phases of compassion fatigue specifically. So that leads me to ask you guys, and you don't have to answer, just again, want you to do some self-awareness, some self-evaluating. What does it look like for you? What phase have you experienced? What phase have you may not experienced? Where do you find yourself now, right? Did any of those signs and symptoms resonate with you? And some of you may be thinking like, oh, I'm fine, I'm a professional. Like I've had 10 CASA cases. I've been doing this for 5-10 years, right? But I want you to think about that. I want you to take some time really to reflect on you, right? Your emotions and reflect on some of the questions that I have there on the screen, right? So what do you identify as the hardest part of your role? And does anything from your day stay with you when you finish your duties? Is there something that you just can't seem to forget about when the day is over? Something that might be keeping you up at night, so to speak, right? Do you frequently find yourself not being able to empathize as readily as before? That's really the key question there. All right. And some other things to consider and ask yourselves. Have you noticed a shift in your connection with others the last few years, right? Do you have any strategies to stay refreshed and refueled? Have there been any events in maybe your own personal lives or in the volunteer work that you do that has caused you to feel that sense of loss or that sense of grief, right? How are you processing those feelings in those events? Many of you for your volunteer work, right? Does it require you to work on the front line, right? Are you out in the community? Are you in those courtrooms, hearing those stories, right? Seeing those sad faces? Are you visiting children in hospitals, right? Think of things like that. Visiting people in jails or in prisons and different systems, different facilities, right? What strategies do you have to prepare before, during, and after those events or those interactions? Okay. And what hurdles might you be facing, right? Do you have a support network to discuss and kind of process those things? So again, want you guys just to begin to start self-evaluating and thinking about how it may be impacting you, if any. So I have a couple of tools that I'm going to go over with you guys, just to, again, to help you address compassion fatigue. I'm also going to drop a couple of copies of things in the chat for you so that you can take them away with you as well after today's presentation. Just give me 1 second. So the first one here I have is called the 5-degree scale worksheet. So I'm dropping that PDF in the chat. It's a fillable PDF. So, and for whatever reason, if it's not for you, it might be your Adobe or whatever PDF reader you use on your computer device, but you could always print it out and use it as well. So if anyone has ever heard of the stoplight scale, this is similar, but it allows for more layers, which I like. So if starting from left to right, you have in that green area, level 1, right? Feeling calm and relaxed. Moving to level 2, feeling okay. Level 3, a little unsettled, right? That yellow area. Level 4 is when we're starting to see that not coping well kind of feelings and symptoms. And then 5, that red area is where we're exhausted, right? We're unable to function. We're feeling overwhelmed. So if you were able to download that PDF and open it up, every tool takes some thought to work, right? This one is no different. So I want you guys to look at it. You can actually fill out in each section how you feel, right? What behaviors are beginning to emerge at each stage, right? How are you feeling internally at each stage? If you're in that orange area, that not coping well, what helps you calm down, right? So you can avoid being completely in the red or overwhelmed. And you can start making a tangible list of things, right? Tangible things that you can do that are truly helpful to you. And think about, even when you're in the green areas, what can you do to help yourself avoid those orange and red areas? Is there a preparatory activity or tool that'll help, right? Or some kind of wind down tool? Is it when you finish your work day, or you finish doing some volunteer work, do you talk with a friend, go for a walk, right? Is it spending time with your children, your grandchildren, spending time with your pet? Some things like that. And then you can also use this tool to consider ways that maybe your colleagues, if you're working with other people on different cases, or different volunteer work, or even your family can help you, and you can share those behaviors. Ask them to share behaviors with you, right? What do they see from you when you're not coping well? That's another way to help with some self-awareness, right? What does that look like to them, and what can they do that will be supportive, and what should they not do, right? Um, so again, this PDF, and this actually will be pretty useful, not just for yourselves and even like family and friends, but some of the people that you're working with in your volunteer work. You might be able to apply this to that as well. It has a lot of questions in there to help you discover your emotions and your feelings at each stage, and your behaviors. So I really want you guys to take advantage of it, right? List out what you feel physically, emotionally, list out those behaviors in each category, because by understanding those feelings, and understanding them much better, actually, you can begin to recognize the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue. You can see how they might correlate, which leads me to my next tool. Just by a show of hands, is anyone familiar with the feelings wheel already? I see some nods. Nice, perfect. So I'm gonna drop a copy of that. There's plenty of different like versions of this, but I'm gonna drop it in the chat for you guys as well. Um, I really love this tool. Sometimes it's hard to identify, right, the feelings that you have and actually place a name on them. Sometimes we create a code for our feelings, and sometimes we use that code for so long, you've forgotten what the actual core emotion behind that feeling is. So the feelings wheel was created by Dr. Gloria Wilcox. And again, this is another way to explore feelings with more depth. Labeling emotions can help us understand the why behind them, right? Thus making us feel less reactive, more in control, and more in control specifically of our emotions, our feelings, and our behaviors. So I encourage you guys to use both tools and to use them together. Honestly, I think it'll be helpful. That way, the feelings will can also kind of help you bridge or create a bridge from one emotion to another, and start to initiate some change, right? And again, this will be something that will also be useful for some of the people that you work with in your volunteer work as well. So here I have, we can't talk about compassion fatigue without discussing resilience, right? Resilience is a big conversation, and it's only going to continue to grow. So I have on the screen the 5 pillars of resilience, but really quickly, for those who might not be familiar, right? Resilience is the process of adapting well, right, in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress. It means bouncing back from difficult experiences. So this resilience is the ability to recover and continue on, right, in the face of adversity without being overwhelmed or being reactionary and acting in dysfunctional ways. So like I said before, right, compassion fatigue is the inability to recover. Resilience allows us to do so. So just like compassion fatigue, anyone and everyone, I think, can have resilience and build their resilience as well. So this isn't something that should be looked at as like an achievement. It's a mindset or a skill that can be learned and improved, right? And it's even better, you can apply it to the work that you do. Typically, the pillars of resilience are referring to just like your personal things, but I think you can also apply it to some of the volunteer work that you do as well. You can call it your professional resilience, so to speak, right? Your ability to bounce back and thrive in those demanding and maybe challenging volunteer experiences as well. So the 5 pillars are self-awareness, right? And I'm sure everyone is aware with that, or familiar with that, right? Having the conscious knowledge of your own personality, right? Your strengths, your weaknesses, your motivations, your emotions. It's kind of piggybacking off of the 2 tools that I dropped in the chat for you guys, right? Self-awareness also allows us to understand how other people around us perceive us. So, something that I picked up in one of my former presentations on this, in discussion, we made like a formula. So I want you guys to remember this. Self-awareness plus being able to identify your triggers equals what you can and cannot control, right? So being self-aware and being able to identify what your triggers might be will allow you to understand what you can and decipher what you can and what you can't control. I think that's very, very useful, especially in the work that you do as volunteers. And then you have purpose. Purpose helps us to shape our mindset and our attitude towards others, right? And towards our experiences. It allows us to recognize that we belong or serve something bigger than ourselves. So think of your own values and morals, right? Or even from earlier. I know everybody, I saw it in the chat. I was in the webinar session this morning. Everybody got the question right on what the judiciary's values were, right? That independence, integrity, fairness, and quality service. You can even consider those and use that as your light and moving forward. But purpose allows you to help build that resilience, understanding that you are belonging or serving something bigger than yourselves, right? Mindfulness. That's our ability to be fully present, aware of where we are, who we are, right? What we're doing, not being overly reactive or overwhelmed by what's going on around you. When you're mindful, you're able to observe your thoughts, right? And your feelings from a distance without judging them as good or bad. And every time you bring more awareness to what you're experiencing, you're strengthening that ability to be present or to be mindful. The only thing that is always in our control at any given point in time is being present with what you're doing and who you are being, right? And how you're presenting. So I want you guys to keep that in mind as well. And then positive relationships, right? Positive relationships are those people in our lives, right, who support and care for us, and we care for them just as much, right? I think often, and I'm sure you guys might not because you're volunteers, but I think often we overlook that as humans, we're gifts to one another. We're here to help each other, right? And one of the most profound experiences that we can have in our lives is the connections that we have with other human beings. I mean, just think about Debbie's speech earlier. I actually shed a tear behind the scenes as well too, right? The connections that we have with others are just so profound. So having positive relationships and those connections only increases your resilience, okay? And then last but not least, we have self-care. Obviously, self-care looks different for everyone. It's the practice of, taking action to maintain or improve your health, right? So it's really up to you to make that intentional effort to practice your self-care. So keep that in mind as well as you guys move forward through being selfless volunteers in the work that you do. So maintaining all of these skills and these 5 pillars takes practice. But being able to use them can help reframe your thinking, your behavior, right? The way that you see yourselves, the world around us, right? It can allow us to see those things in new ways. So taking this holistic approach to resilience will not only help us manage, the stress in our lives, but can positively impact our overall well-being in a significant way, right? It can help us bring down and lessen the risk of compassion fatigue. So last but not least, some other resources that I have, which you guys might be familiar with already. I just want to drop some links in the chat for you. The first is the Mental Health Association in New Jersey. Really great organization. They have resources available for individuals, families, and more. Hopefully that link's work. It did not work, but it's in there for you. And then the other one that I have is NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness in New Jersey. They are also a great organization. Lots of resources available, different programs and support groups as well. They actually have, if people are not familiar, they have a local chapter for each county here in New Jersey. So you can go on their website and find the local chapter in whatever county that you're in and see the good work that they're doing and what kind of support groups or programs they have available. All right. And then as we slowly wrap up, I have a video that I want to play for you guys. And then I'll summarize once it's done, and then we'll be good to go for the day. So just give me a thumbs up that you guys can hear once I start playing. Perfect.
So I have in my hand a bottle of water, and it's just an average bottle of water. There's nothing particularly different or unique about this bottle of water. But it is a bottle, and it does contain water, and I've just removed the cap. So here's my question. Why is there water on the floor?
Sorry, guys.
Why is there water on the floor? Any guesses? Because there was a shaking? All right, thank you for playing. Wrong. We're going to make this fun, aren't we? Why is there water on the floor? I took the cap off and I allowed the water to go on the floor. Wonderful answer. Wrong. Thank you for playing. Isn't this much fun? I shook a full bottle of water. And Lou, that's a great answer, but again, it's wrong. We might think of a lot of reasons why there might be water on the floor. We could think that maybe there's water on the floor because of gravity. And as already has been said, because I took the cap off or because there's a shaking. But here's what we know that is universally true. The reason why there's now water on the floor is because there was water in the bottle. And I want you to reflect on that for just a moment as a metaphor, as an example of what we're going to be talking about today in terms of stress, body arousal, compassion fatigue. And what I'd like to suggest to all of us is that the shaking is not abnormal. It is the normal part of life and the work experience. The shaking is normal. And the reason why there is water spilling out onto the floor from the bottle has less to do with the shaking and it has much more to do with there's water in the bottle. Now, if we compare this, a bottle that's now only nearly full, as a moment ago it was completely full of water, if we compare that to this bottle where the water level is not at filled but much lower, pointing out that the water level is here. And when this bottle of water experiences the very same shaking, there's little to no water that spills out. So in this demonstration today, we're creating an awareness and a context that the water level is kind of representative of the level of stress, and in some situations, toxic stress or compassion fatigue, either in the workplace or even in our own personal life. And our goal today, and the goal that's a part of our mission for the work that we do and for the people for whom we serve, is not about getting the shaking to stop, because that's not something that's within our reach. So overcoming compassion fatigue with professional resiliency is not about stopping the triggers, stopping the shaking, or somehow magically changing our work environment to be ideal. But in fact, we're overcoming compassion fatigue with our own personal, professional resiliency, which in fact lowers our stress levels, lowers our toxicity, so that we have a lower threshold and an optimum range for tolerating changes in the environment.
So, I really like this video as I wrap up this presentation because I think it highlights the biggest takeaway, right? Communities needing help, right, and support does not stop, and it will not stop. Life goes on, people get sick, pandemics occur, earthquakes occur, trauma happens every day. And we talked a little bit about what's in our control today. So we need to continue to discuss and explore ways to remain healthy and to understand what is in our control in order to continue to provide our crucial and necessary services, right? I know Judge Grant said to you guys this morning, not this morning, well, earlier this afternoon in his speech about the work that you do for our organization. You guys have to understand that you really do contribute a lot to our organization. I understand, I've been a volunteer myself and I know how that feels. I know the joys and the lows and the frustrations that it may bring. Volunteering is not always easy, but right, how we respond during our most challenging times really speaks to our character. So we want to thank you guys, right? Despite any hardships that you have might face on your own, or even through your work as a volunteer here with the judiciary, you still showed up. You still showed up every day. You still showed up for someone else, another, may it be a parent, a child, just any individual here that you've been working for, you've experienced or interact with during your volunteer work here at the judiciary. But believe it or not, you reinstated the value of our organization, right? You reinstated the value of that individual, that child, that family, the value of our community, right? And you help continue to build the trust, the public's trust specifically in our judiciary system. So whether you are a volunteer with CASA, GMP, or the JCC, or one of the other many programs that we have and that we partner with, you should know by showing up, even on the days when life feels the toughest, or when things just aren't going your way, you continue to help transform the judiciary service. So please keep doing what you do. The value of yourselves as volunteers and the value of the work that you do is insurmountable. So I want to thank you guys for your service, your dedication, as well as your time. And I hope you enjoyed today's presentation and you enjoyed the end note of today's event as well. So if there are any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. I will be here for a couple of more minutes before I have to close the room for someone else. So thank you again for joining me this afternoon, and I wish you all the best.